Hey guys, lots of people want to know what causes magazine spring wear. Is it leaving them loaded for long periods of time like you might do with a carry gun? Or is it constantly loading and unloading them like you might do with your practice mags for your carry gun? So what I have here today is the conclusion of an impromptu long-term test that began about 5.5 years ago when I loaded up these 3 magazines. Since then I've also loaded these magazines about 4 years ago. These are Glock 21 mags. And about 5 years ago, I loaded up this Ruger LC9 magazine and left it loaded. So you can note that I've got all these sort of marked according to how they were loaded. And you also note that the unloaded magazines actually have ammo in them. I put some regular ball ammo in them because I'm not confident that there isn't some sort of effect where when you load a magazine up and then unload it, that the spring doesn't take a while to relax to its fully uncompressed state. And what I'm going to do here today is unload these magazines, disassemble them, and measure the length of the magazine spring from tip to tip. So from left to right, we've got the M&P 9 mags over here. We've got 2 unloaded magazines that have been used continually at the range, just loaded and unloaded. I loaded these up just before I started these video to full capacity. 3 loaded M&P magazines, again, 5.5 years, sorry. 2 unloaded Glock magazines for Glock 21 and 45 ACP. These have also been continually loaded and unloaded for practice use. 2 loaded magazines for the same gun. You'll note this one says L-S, and that means that this one was loaded seated in the gun for most of its life. One of the M&P mags was for quite a while as well, but after a while I unloaded that gun and started keeping it unloaded because I started competing with it and I wanted to use it for dry fire. So I don't know which one of these magazines was the one that had the most time seated in the gun. Over here with the Ruger LC9, I've got 2 unloaded magazines that I use quite frequently to practice at the range. I'll take the carry magazine out and I will load up ball ammo in my 2 practice magazines and I'll practice with them. And then, of course, the loaded carry magazine that has the L-S indicating that it was loaded seated, which when you seat a magazine, it compresses the round stack a little bit further than it would if you're just carrying a spare magazine in a pouch or something like that. So what I'm going to do now is unload all these magazines and disassemble them. All right, so as you can see, I've got all of the magazines unloaded, the springs taken out and measured. The measurements are all notated along the top here. Maybe not what you were expecting. I somewhat expected this. I had a hunch that this is what the result might be. I just didn't know which magazines would exhibit this to which degree. So on the M&P 9, which the magazines were loaded for 5.5 years, those particular magazines exhibited a good deal of shortening of the spring, and certainly with a shorter spring you get less tension, especially when you've got the last round coming out of the magazine and the follower trying to engage the slide block. The shortest unloaded magazine spring was 6 3/16 inches, and the longest loaded magazine was 5 7/8 inches. That's a not insignificant difference, and you can see that it's a very visible difference. I would say that those springs from being loaded are significantly weaker than they were before. What remains to be seen is if that is weak enough to cause any malfunctions, and we are going to load all these magazines back up and test them. So we'll see about that. The Glock 21, having been loaded for 4 years, again, I think this is highly dependent on magazine design and how the magazine was engineered. Very little difference, maybe an 1/8 of an inch, a 1/16 of an inch difference between the unloaded and loaded magazines. The Ruger LC9, quite a difference there. The 2 unloaded magazines, both the same measurement, 5 9/16. The loaded spring, quite a bit shorter at 5 1/8. And I can see now on the camera that it's kind of at an odd angle, so we'll put these sort of back to back so you can see the difference in length. Not insignificant. It almost looks like it's missing a whole coil. Again, I don't know if that is enough to cause a malfunction. So we're going to load those magazines back up with the ammo that was in them and test it out. I have a few theories as to why I got the result that I did. Most people on the internet will tell you that what wears out magazine springs is, or any spring, any compression spring, is constant compression and decompression because the spring is designed not to go beyond its elastic limit when it's fully compressed. That might be true, and it obviously might apply to the Glock 21 more than the M&P9 or the Ruger LC9. However, the magazine might have been designed to get one more round in the magazine rather than have a spring that will not travel beyond its elastic limit. So there's two types of deformation when it comes to a spring. There is elastic deformation, which is what happens when you squeeze the spring and let it go back and it returns to its original size. And there is plastic deformation, which is what happens when the spring is actually bent or takes a set. And there's two things that are going on when a magazine spring might lose length. Set happens immediately if you load up a magazine and immediately unload it, and that magazine spring is shorter. It has taken a set because the spring has gone beyond its elastic limits. Another phenomenon called spring creep is what I believe to be responsible for most of this, because again, we loaded up all these magazines, and right before the video, I loaded up the unloaded magazines to full capacity, yet they don't exhibit any permanent effects. So spring creep happens over time. When a spring is compressed near its elastic limit, spring creep is a very slow phenomenon where the spring slowly loses compression strength or length. And I think that is what is at work here. What I want to know is if the designers of these magazines factored that into their design. So when they were, designing the spring, were they cutting corners to get one more round in there? Or were they designing a spring that, yes, will exhibit some spring creep, maybe some plastic deformation as well, but will, over the long haul, work just fine? Most of the people that I've heard tell stories on the internet say something like, well, I found my dad's 1911 in a drawer. It's been loaded for 50 years, and I shot it, and it worked just fine. But that's not really a test with any sort of control, because they also didn't have an unloaded magazine sitting next to it that they compared to the loaded magazine. So whether there's a difference between a magazine that's been loaded for 50 years and a 1911 and one that hasn't from any particular 1911 magazine manufacturer, that still remains to be seen. I haven't seen anybody post any sort of test like that. But I think this test was fairly well controlled for how impromptu it was, because I just sort of said, hey, I've had these magazines loaded for a while. I think I'll leave them loaded, and I won't even use them for anything. I'll just keep them loaded with hollow points, and at some point down the road, I will test them out and see what happens. And I'm selling the M&P9, so that means the test had to go down, and I couldn't wait for more subjects to be added to the test over time. So what you see is what you get. Sorry about that. So what we're going to do is take these magazines out to the range after we reassemble them and load them back up with the ammo that was in them, which has also been sitting in them for 4 to 5.5 years. And we're going to shoot all of that ammo and see if we get any malfunctions. I don't believe we will. If we do get any malfunction, it might be like a failure to lock back. And that's not a hugely significant malfunction in my mind, and it wouldn't, to me, it wouldn't be cause to replace that magazine spring like every year or something, because I know it's going to eventually have a failure. I think that's an okay failure to have. Alrighty, so we got all the loaded magazines loaded back up with their hollow points, and those hollow points are just as old again as the magazines are, and have been loaded into the gun the whole time, or sorry, loaded into the magazines the whole time. So we're going to take those to the range. We're going to test fire with the Glock and the Ruger. I actually have one extra round for those, the Barney round, because they were loaded to their maximum capacity, which is 13+1 for the Glock and 7+1 for the LC9. So we're going to test fire all those rounds and magazines and see what, if any, malfunctions we get.
Testing at the range went as I expected. No malfunctions and all magazines locked to the rear. It should be noted that I do not rotate my carry ammo, so this exact ammunition has been sitting in the magazines the entire time they've been loaded. I am not overly concerned about dud ammo as a result of oil or moisture making its way into the primer or powder. I do not over-lubricate my firearms, and I certainly don't lubricate the magazines or the firing pin channel. I do sweat on my LC9 quite a bit since I've carried it literally every day, even in the summer when I'm working outside, for 5 years now, bar the odd trip to a state like Illinois. But I have not found excess moisture has made it into the magazine or chamber, so it hasn't been concerning. I also use quality ammunition, Winchester LE Ranger T-Series, in all 3 firearms. I would personally have no qualms running the M&P magazines just as they are, but because I'm selling the gun to a friend, I replaced the springs with fresh ones. I reloaded the LC9 with hollow points at the range in the same magazine and carried it home. I may do additional testing on that particular magazine in the future, but I expect no issues. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel for future updates. If you found the content interesting, please share this video with your friends. Or do not, I am not a beggar.